To this open group webinar today. This is the latest in a series of events about TOGAF. I'm very pleased today that we have two very good speakers. We have Gary Doherty representing the open group, and we have Tim Neal from Evolution. This event is scheduled to last about an hour. That will be about 45 minutes of presentation. We hope to think about 10-15 minutes of questions at the end of the event. Before we start the event, and I hand it over to Gary to start the presentation, I'd just like to cover off a few housekeeping rules. We would like to encourage you to answer questions. The best way to ask questions and submit your questions is by the chat or text facilities on the hand of your screen. When you submit your questions, it's preferable if you make them addressed to all attendees. That way everyone gets to see what questions have been submitted. And we'd like to handle all questions at the end of the event. And so we are now, we've just gone past the top of the hour. So if you're ready, you'll start the presentation.
Okay. Hi everyone, my name is Gary Doherty. I'm the TOGAF product manager. So I'm just going to give you a few minutes of introduction to the open group and what we're about. Then I'm going to hand over to Tim O'Neill from Evolution, and who is also the co-chair of the Open Group Architecture Forum Certification Standing Committee. So let's get going. So what is Open Group all about? Well, we have a vision of something we call boundaryless information flow. Now, on the surface, that sounds pretty anarchic. It really isn't. It's really about sure that we can communicate between organizations at appropriate levels and appropriate ways so that suppliers, customers, and whoever can actually interoperate in appropriate ways. Obviously, this has to be done in a secure and timely manner. It really is about make sure that where we have boundaries, they are permeable the right way to make sure that we can engage internally and externally in that way. Obviously, agility is a critical factor of boundaryless information flow. So customers, they need integrated information. They need access to the information when they need it so that everyone can generate the right benefit that everyone needs in order to get the business done, do it in the most cost-efficient way. So why is the vision important? Well, the cause of this is without boundaryless information flow. Just imagine if there was no systems interoperability, what would happen if the chaos that would result from being completely unable to exchange information. So they're real pain. You know, there are hundreds of millions of dollars lost in opportunities, and organizations are spending billions of dollars to try and make themselves work in an interoperable fashion. So, for example, when we asked attendees at one of our conferences, they responded and said that, yes, this problem of difficulties with interoperability, the lack of boundaryless information flow, did have real and tangible ramifications. There are very large organizations out there spending lots of money and missing real opportunities because there is not very much integrated information out there. But it's worse than that, because it's not just about the finance problems that organizations can feel pain of. There's a real and tangible physical benefit that are things are going wrong out there. For example, 9/11, 999 systems not working, critical infrastructure systems falling down, air traffic control systems. So we can see that there's a real link between human life and this interoperability problem exists. So the Europe does a number of members, 350 enterprises with headquarters in 31 countries. We're a global organization. You can see that despite being a small organization, we do have a genuine global presence. What we're looking at doing is really trying to help our member organizations achieve their business objectives through appropriate open standards. It's value that Open Group members get. Well, it helps member organizations to understand what's going on in the marketplace so that as an organization they can they will have insights into where the development of standards is heading. That gives, in many cases, organizations a competitive edge and allows them to develop the right products at the right time and into the right markets. And to contribute to this whole wave of getting standards developed. Obviously, the additional benefit is that of networking. There are a lot of very important organizations involved with the Open Group, and it might be a small organization, but you can have access to some of these key influencers, and you can talk to them, meet them, understand their points of view, try and influence them. So really, there are some great opportunities there to be had. And what about scope of the Open Group membership? Well, we've got a mix of activities going on. So we've got a number of work groups, IT architect certification, IT specialist certification, or business forum. We've got a business architecture work group. We've got a number of people working cloud, semantic operability, SOA. We've got a number of managed consortia with associated industry forums. And then the sort of crowning achievement is arguably the architecture for which has been driver behind developing TOGAF, with a number of other forums like Archimate, identity management, platform, real-time and embedded systems and security. Then what about the architecture forum? What happens within the architecture forum itself? Well, we've got a vision of being important, recognized global enterprise architecture organization, and we're already well down the track in establishing ourselves as that. And about at the core of the architecture forum is the need to drive forward and develop the whole portion of enterprise architecture. And obviously, TOGAF is a core element of that, but we need as much help as we can. There are only so many volunteers, and only so much work that can be done at any given time. And what you bear in mind, what's important about the Architecture Forum is that it's the members who do the work. They're the ones making the contribution to what is going on. And that's one of the great unique selling points that we have as an organization. It's not the Open Group doing some work and then asking people if they agree. It's actually our members who are out there in the real world, practical enterprise architects engaged in real work, and they are the ones who drive forward what it is that we do. That's our sales pitch, so I'm going to hand over now to Tim from Evolution. So thanks for your time.
Gary, and thanks, Simon. So I'm not sure, Gary and Simon, I think you can probably still speak. You guys can hear me okay, can you? That's okay, is it, Simon?
Yes, Tim, you sound fine.
Great. Okay, so is my desktop being shared? Or no, I should start sharing here, should I? There we go. So it's okay. Sorry, just to check, Simon, you can see my desktop okay, can you?
Yeah, do you want to get your presentation up?
Yep, sure. So I assume that's okay, is it, Simon? I'll step through these. And I did see there was a bit of lag with some of Gary's slides, so I'll try and take my time through this as well. So we're here today to talk about some tool support for TOGAF 9 and talk about how Abacus can do that. So the first thing to really have a look at is a bit of a crash course in TOGAF 9, because I guess we can't assume that everyone knows the standard maybe as well as some others. So I'll give a bit of a crash course in the different terms. It's a very, it's obviously a 1,000-page document. There's a lot of content in there. So I'll give a bit of a crash course in some of the terms, and then a bit of a live demonstration of a simple project that the Open provide in the Abacus toolset, and as Simon indicated, we'll do some Q&A at the end. So we've got a few objectives. Obviously, what we want to achieve today. It's a short period of time, but hopefully we can still get some of these done. So obviously, you want a bit of an understanding of what in standard is called the content metamodel and framework. So there's all loaded terms there, including all the different things like entities and relationships and views and dashboards and deliverables, all those sorts of things. Look at Evolution's perspective on enterprise modelling, and indeed how Abacus, the product set, can support TOGAF 9. So Abacus is a TOGAF certified product, as Gary indicated, I'm the co-chair of the Tools Certification Committee, so I'm working with some colleagues, some other member colleagues, to establish the criteria by which we can certify tools going forward. Need to see, hopefully by the end of it we can start imagining we can get our hands dirty and start doing some modelling according to TOGAF 9. So let's have a look at some of those things. Thing to look at is hopefully what we're all sort of familiar with. It's affectionately called the crop circle or the WAM wheel. So it's the architecture development method, talking about the different phases. So I need to say there is a sort of business aspect to it, an application aspect, a data aspect, and a technology aspect, and various phases that talk about sort of migration planning and change management and things like that. All just around, of course, requirements management at the centre. Next thing to look at, and this is all really about, it's part 4 in the TOGAF standard, so it's all part 4. That's around chapter 35 or something like that. Needless to say, it's what's called the architecture content framework, and it specifies, as we talked about, the deliverables, the artifacts, all things that you need, and indeed how you would embody them into what's called an architecture repository. So it talks about the work products known as deliverables that you get stakeholders to basically review and sign off on, the artifacts, which are the individual things that go into the work products, and we'll look at a lot of those today, and then the building blocks, which are hopefully some sort of quick start, reusable things to help to produce those work products and those deliverables. The next slide talks about specifically the content metamodel, as it's called, and so in TOGAF 9 it's defined as the entities, so these are the objects or the things, and it specifies things like application, data entity, physical component, actor, business service, so all of the things that you would need to necessarily build the artifacts and produce the dashboards. Then relationships between them, or the links or the connections. So the examples like an actor consumes a business service, or a driver motivates an organisation unit. So it's the things and then the relationships between those things. And then the artifacts, which indeed are the different types of viewpoints you can produce, and they're broken up into 3 types. Catalogues, which are sort of tabular data, matrices, which are sort of XY grids, and then diagrams, which are your standard 2-dimensional pictures of boxes and lines. So they're the entities in the Metamodel itself. If we start to look at the content metamodel here, this is what's called the core metamodel. So hopefully that's sort of refreshed quick enough. So let's say there's about 20 different entities and 20 different relationships. And as we were looking at things like an organisation unit owns a function, stuff like that. So different relationships between things, and then that's extended into what's called the extension metamodel. So there's various extensions built on top of that core metamodel for things like motivation, infrastructure consolidation, process modelling, stuff like that. So that's a complete metamodel, and it has about sort of 30 entities and about 30 relationship types. But needless to say, that's the complete set you could need to support a full TOGAF 9 deployment. Go into those, understanding that you have those different entities and relationships. You then start to build what are called artifacts or viewpoints. So this slide here is a sort of called the viewpoint catalogue, and it divides them up into, as we talked about, the different catalogues here, then the different matrices through here, and then the different diagrams across here. Now it separates them into business, data, application, technology, architecture vision, requirements management, so all the different phases of the ADM are capped there, and then of course the different extension diagrams are shown as well. Bear in mind though, that means there is potentially 56 viewpoints, so you certainly need to be selective about what you do. On to the concept of stakeholders. So the TOGAF standard is very good about talking about being focused on producing information that helps certain stakeholders make decisions. Okay, so in the example project, they define a number of different stakeholder groups, the corporate groups, the end user and external groups. So these different stakeholders are well defined and what they're interested in seeing, and goes into what's called dashboards. So each of the stakeholders here, the CXOs, the PMO, things like that, it talks about their interest and then the viewpoints that they're concerned with seeing. So you can see here, CXO is interested in 3 different viewpoints there. Okay. Ultimately can be built up into dashboards, and I'll show you those later. called Deliverables. So the TOGAF, obviously the TOGAF method produces Word documents or whatever documents you want in whatever form. So there's about 20 different deliverables defined. The important one tends to be this architecture definition document here, which spans the full sort of suite of the things that you may want to produce. So we'll have a look at that one as a specific output from a repository as well. So like I said, really just a quick crash course in TOGAF and some of that terminology that we'll now have a look at. So there's my contact details there. So while I'm obviously involved with Evolution, I'm also a research fellow with a university in Australia. So that's the University of Technology there in Sydney. So send me an email, obviously, if you have any questions. And there are files of Abacus available, and there's an HTML version of the whole repository we're going to show you that we can provide so people can navigate through that and explore. And I'll give you a quick demonstration of that as well. And, of course, drop an email to us there, togaf@evolution.com.au, if you have any questions as well. That's the PowerPoint part of the session. And was that okay? That came across okay, was it? My volume and everything before I just...
Good. Just keep an eye on the volume, Tim, but that's fine.
Sure. Sorry about that.
Thanks, mate.
Okay, look, let's talk into Abacus now. So this is the TOGAF 9 project opened with Abacus. We'll do a sort of a bottom-up approach to this. There's obviously many different ways you can look at things, the bottom-up, middle-out, top-down, all those different things. But sort of build it up as a bit of layers of an onion. So we'll start at the centre here, and basically what's called, in Abacus terms, implementations. So implementations are reusable standards. And if we're familiar with the standards information base in TOGAF, it defines several hundred different standard technologies and standards that can then be reused and used to govern the way that you produce your architecture. So here you have things like data management standards, things like SQL. If we look over here, you've got attributes with each of these standards. So SQL here as a standard was adopted in 1992. It also has an ISO equivalent, and as we saw, it's a data management services standard. Now we've extended that to allow you to put some extra properties here on whether the standards have been approved, when they may have been approved, and when the end of life may be. So you can start to do some governance around your standards in the architecture repository as well. And so in the example itself, there's a number of in-use standards here that you can see. And if you look at something like AIX6 here, it's an operating system standard, and in this case, for this sample project, it's an approved standard. It was approved in 2007, and it's expired 2020. So these are all obviously sort of somewhat entered to use here. But needs to say this portion of the repository is where you define the standards catalogue. Okay. With that, we talk about, in Abacus terms, component types and connection types. So follow an IEEE 1471 nomenclature. We talk about components, connections, and then the constraints that they have. So these components are synonymous with the entities as per the TOGAF content metamodel. We've got them grouped into different areas here, and if we look at the architectural context, you can sort of entity types there. So you've got viewpoints, requirements, things like that. If we come into the bid area here, you've got all those things that you'd expect. So there's measures and goals and drivers and locations and things like that. If we look at location, for example, there's a number of properties that the content metamodel specifies should have. For example, its category and whatever a postcode and things like that. If we go into area, there's just one type there called the data entity. If we go to applications, there's applications and application modules. I'll show you a visual view of this in a second, but I'm just sort of starting off at the bottom. Into the technology architecture here, you can see different elements, things like logical components and physical components, all with attributes as we'd expect. Now, connection types, which are the relationships between things. So there's a number of connection types or relationships that are defined. So if we look at things like a motivates relationship, it's defined some rules saying that motivates goes between a driver and an organisational unit. So what that's saying is that a driver motivates an organisational unit. So it's a way that we specify the rules or the constraints within the repository. And connections can have properties too, just like components. So here there's an involved relationship with the type of involvement using a RACI technique there. So properties on connections is just as important as properties on components themselves, of course. And build up the repository, and metamodel, you get into what we call templates, or view templates in this case. So we're looking here at different diagram types. Okay, so you can see we've defined the diagram types here for what makes up the TOGAF content metamodel framework. So you've got your things like business footprint diagram and class diagram and things like that. So we'll look at examples of those, of course, as we go through the sample project. To say all those things make up the metamodel, your standards or your implementations, the types, and then the viewpoint templates that you're creating. Now, of course, you can look at all that pictorially, so let's have a quick look at the visualization of that metamodel here in a two-dimensional way. So that's showing the metamodel as a way visually, so we can see those things that we were talking about, like a driver motivates organizational units, organizational unit owns a function, functions can be hierarchically defined, organizational units can be hierarchically defined. So we're looking at the business architecture elements here in the blue section. The kind of pinky section up here is the architectural context, and you do have principles and requirements, things like that. As on the page here, as I sort of scroll down to some of the more technical areas, you've got your data area here with data entities. You've then got your application area here with IS services, applications, application modules within applications. You have your technology area here with logical components, physical components, all that kind of stuff. Okay, so that's a way of just seeing the way that the metamodel hangs together visually. Now the iconography that's in here, so the fact that we've used a blue hexagon for an IS service and a green rounded rectangle for a process, that is certainly Evolution's invention. There isn't a standard about what sort of symbology you should use yet in TOGAF 9, so you certainly can use other standards such as Archimate, which some of us are familiar with, or BPMN notations for the process things. It's pretty flexible, but needless to say, we've sort of chosen this symbology through some experience and some deployments. Well, of course, that's a fixed kind of representation of the metamodel, but part of TOGAF is all about being able to tailor the metamodel to be an appropriate set for an organisation. So we can see here, for example, that we've decided there should be applications and application modules, logical components, physical components. But when you look at the way some organisations work, often it's useful to have a more concrete example of an application. And in the TOGAF metamodel, that's called a physical application component, and this is then called a logical application component. So there's nothing to stop us adding those things. So in Abacus here, we can come back and add object type into our application domain. So let's put in a physical application component. Slow typing. We've got there's a new object type that we could add. So you can add any object type you like with Abacus. Now we need to sort of set up some sort of iconography for this. So on the stencil view, which is the thing that maps diagram here, we could associate this type with, let's say, a trapezoid or something like that. That'll allow us to now add these elements to this diagram. So let's make a bit of space for it down here in the application area and just create one of those on here. So that object there, you've now got a new physical application component here. Now these objects, of course, can have any attributes you like. So you might decide that they need to have, let's say, information properties, and that information property should be, I don't know, install date or something like that. So again, just really the total configurability to allow you to add anything you want in here. So that probably should be a date time property. So now, of course, these elements can have that property there as a property. So any object types you like, any attributes you like, and then again, of course, any new relationship types you like. And so we should look at relationship type now, and typically what you would define as that this component realizes this component. That tends to be the way it's specified in the metamodel. We take the realizes relationship here, associate here. Now, what Abacus here is throwing is that you've basically broken the metamodel, because the metamodel defines that a realizes relationship should be between objective and a goal. So that's just the way core metamodel specifies things. So we can change that. So if we go into our relationships here and we look at the realizes one, we had those set of rules. So we can simply add some new constraints here, which say this relationship can go between a physical application component at the source end and the new relationship, which is that the realizers should be connected or can be connected to an application at link end. Okay, so we've got these rules here, which now, of course, allows us to take this connection and attach it here to the application, and that's perfectly fine. It's compliant with the Metamodel. So let's use to configure the Metamodel or tailor it is certainly is there, and so of course, even if there's some slight variations you want to do, you can do that quite easily. Now, that relies on what's called a designer permission in Abacus land, so you need to be able to have the ability to configure the Metamodel, because you don't want everyone to do that. You need to, of course, lock down the Metamodel so people are following the sort of definition that you have. That's really, like I said, that's a theory. It's a bit of kind of background to how you can configure the tool, definitely, and how it has obviously been configured to support TOGAF 9. So let's go and look at this sample project now, so to really look at some practice here rather than some theory. So back here into the TOGAF 9 sample, we'll open this view here, which is that viewpoint catalogue view. It should certainly be familiar from the PowerPoint I showed you before, and certainly the standard itself. As I described, the viewpoint catalogue talks about catalogues, makes these diagrams, it splits them up into business, for information system stuff, so data and application, technology stuff, requirements, all those sort of things. You can do a bit of a quick walkthrough. There's obviously a lot of views here, so we're not going to cover them all today. We don't have time for that. Needless to say, as I described, I can provide the HTML version of this, and you can navigate it to your heart's content. Well, let's have a few. So let's pick maybe the principles catalogue here. Okay. The way this has been set up is that while all the content's in the repository itself, we've pushed the content out to some Excel spreadsheets here, so you can see that you've got, these are just a set of standard principles that the standard gives. So you've got some business principles here, you've got some data principles, you've got some application principles, technology principles. So standard principles there as a catalogue or a table. A pretty powerful catalogue is the requirements catalogue. So this is the way it's defined in TOGAF. You have a list of requirements. They're of certain type, whether they're a shall, a should, or a may, and they, of course, have rationale and acceptance criteria and things like that. So that's a requirements catalogue. Again, we go across maybe, let's look at the application portfolio catalogue. Okay, this is standard application list or your application register. Most organisations tend to have something like this, so it's a list of the systems that you have. And that actually brings us to a point. There's some work ongoing in the architecture forum to try and tighten up the terminology that's used, because sometimes it's talked about as system, sometimes it's application, sometimes it's logical application component. Some work going on right now to try and become a bit more consistent about the terminology that's used. So, for example, this is called an application portfolio catalogue, but then you'll have other things that are called like a system data matrix. So needless to say, that's trying to get a bit more clean. But anyway, a list of applications with whatever attributes and things like that in an application portfolio catalogue. Okay, we might as well look at this, the technology standards catalogue. So this is that list of all those standards we showed from the standards information base. So you've got all the different things here, they were adopted, what year, all that kind of stuff. Maybe more, let's look at this one, the technology portfolio catalogue. This one is the list of all of the sort of infrastructure. Quite often you'll get this from a CDB or something like that. So it might be a list of computer items or servers, infrastructure, that kind of stuff. With the technology, of course, which should be being reused from the standards catalogue that you have. So needless to say, a list of all the kit that you might have in the tin and wire. So that's a few of the catalogues. I think there's about 15 catalogues, so we won't look at them all. Let's move on and have a look at some of the matrices now in the sample project. So, look, the first one we'll look at, let's look at the stakeholder map matrix. Now, this actually is technically not really a matrix, but it lists the stakeholders down the left here. So that's those lists that we saw back in that presentation. And then it talks about the different viewpoints that they're involved in. So that is the embodiment for organisation in whatever situation of who the stakeholders are and which views or which artefacts they're interested in, which of course comes to forming the dashboards that you want to make. So let's have a look at a traditional matrix, though, something like the system data matrix. So this is one that lists those same three systems that we had before. This time you've got your data entities across the top here, and of course what relationships between them. So the SAP CRM system has create, update, delete on the customer details data entity. So sort of matrices are possible. You certainly can push them out of Abacus as well, but maybe you have a look at a system technology matrix. Okay, so this one shows the systems across the top or applications, and then those infrastructure components down here with, obviously that's saying that the SAP CRM system is hosted as the relationship on the web server number 1 or something like that. So those receipts are all obviously generated from within Abacus, and likewise with the catalogues. And we sort of jump back here and have a quick look in here in the repository itself. There will be, let's say, those principles. So that's the list of principles with all the attributes that they have describing them. You might have the requirements here with all of the, those shoulds and shalls and all that kind of stuff. So all the contents in there, the list of applications, here with, the different attributes of when they go live. And then there's relationships here between the things. So here the relationship between the SIM and the infrastructure it runs on here is shown with a host relationship here to the server. So all of that content, of course, is in the repository, and you're just producing different artifacts out of the tool set that you can distribute. If we have a look at some of the diagrams now, so we've got a whole collection of them here. Perhaps let's look at the business footprint diagrams, a pretty important one. So that view there is showing organisational units. It's showing drivers, it's showing goals, it's showing the functions, it's then showing the services, and then it shows the systems that implement those services. So it's a pretty good top-to-bottom slice, sort of from the top-level strategic things down to the more physical, systems that deliver those strategic things. So a useful view, the business footprint diagram from the sample. You can see it's sort of doing client, customer relationship stuff. Let's go back and have a look at some other views, maybe. Let's have an event diagram. And I hope this is pretty whirlwind. Like I said, there's sort of a lot of views, but hopefully the idea it's box lines, the boxes and lines are defined. That's what the Metamodel does. So this is a top-level sort of process model. Of course, it's not using BPMN in this case. It's using just sort of custom notation, but you certainly could bring BPMN if you liked. And drill down on the processes here and see what's inside that process. Now, by doing that, we've actually gone to another view, the business process flow diagram. Okay, you can link the views together and do all that kind of stuff and drill downs and all those things. Okay, let's jump back to the viewpoint catalogue here. Maybe the organisational decomposition view. So the organisational decomposition diagram here, which is your classic organisational chart. And we're showing here as organisational units with organisational units, but you certainly can do more traditional tree structures like this by dragging, setting elements floating and then dragging them out of their parents and things like that. So more traditional sort of tree representations of these things as well. Okay, last diagram maybe. Let's have a look at this one. Okay, the environments and locations one. So this one, obviously a visual representation of that similar content we saw in the matrix, because you basically, the SAP CRM system here is being hosted on these 3 servers. So the same content, of course, and these diagrams can all be produced dynamically as well. So needless to say, you're obviously trying to slice the information up into different ways and present it in different ways for the stakeholders' interests. Really a bit of a crash course in some of the standard artifacts, and like I said, I wasn't going to go into all of them there. But really what we want to get onto is how you can start to do some analysis with the content that you may have in your architecture repository and start moving beyond phases, maybe CD, and get into some of the more opportunities and solutions and some of the sort of subsequent phases that TOGAF specifies. So when we come on to doing analytics, one of the first things you want to start to look at is sort of impact of change analysis. And a really good way of presenting that is a classic kind of diagram, a 2D diagram, where you're doing effectively the effects that things have. To create a diagram here, we need to choose one of those view templates that we specified. Do a communications engineering diagram. So if we start here, it's obviously filtering to allow the elements that we can have. So there's a network component here. Let's now filter it to only allow the things that are connected to that network component. So now have the relationships to it here, and that will then show the physical components that are connected to it. So, for example, if this switch fell over, what are the different network nodes that are going to be affected by that? So we just put that view. You can see it there. It's a simple 2D diagram that has the switch in the middle here. So you've really just queried the repository and produced a diagram of the content that was already in there. So this is a communications engineering diagram, and you could start to augment this with different different things. You could heat map, for example. So if we turn on the tool here, let's change the colour of rivers to reflect. Maybe we've done a cost analysis piece, so we have an understanding of the total cost to own of each of the bits of kit. So let's colour that from green to red, let's say. Here there's a couple of servers that stand out, and not surprisingly these are the big database servers. We can augment the annotations now. Let's try and include some properties. So let's put the make and model. Now this comes from our standards catalogue. So you can see this is an HP Superdome, as is, so not surprisingly they're the big expensive boxes as opposed to some whatever's and Sun E450s and whatever, things like that. So very easily you can start to present some information from an active change point of view. Of course, what you want to get on to is other ways that you can present the information and the results of analysis. So if you remember, where is it, the organizational diagram. So we have this org chart. So behind the scenes, we might have done a cost simulation. So Abacus includes different techniques doing analysis, like activity-based costing. So we've come through and worked out that the area of your business costs you $96 million. So we could colour the X's according to the heat map, but why not just do a pie chart? I mean, charts are a perfectly valid way of seeing the results of things. So that's a pie chart showing, of course, the relative costs of each of those areas. So while TOGAF 9 doesn't yet specify charts as one viewpoint, there's some work going on to try and increase the number of artefacts that you can produce. So obviously different charts like pie charts and bubble charts. So there's work there in terms of, this is a pie chart, obviously showing cost for the organisational units. You can drill down on that and show particularly the relative costs for the sales portion of your business. Who knows, all different ways of doing that. There's any number of different charts you might want to produce, say an application roadmap. It shows, the timeline on the bottom here, and then the different life cycle stages for the application. So this was the initial live date. This was the last release. This is when it's going to be next release, and that's when it'll be decommissioned, let's say. So a number of different visualizations in forms of charts and life cycles, things like that, bubble charts. All those things are potential candidates to be included into visualizations. Really what we're starting to look at is obviously richer analysis than straight box and line diagrams and things like that, starting to think about the different ways you might want to present information. So there's another way that we talk about, which is three-dimensional visualization. I'm not sure how well it's going to work on over this WebEx, so I don't know if you guys can see that, but it's a 3D visualization of this organisation. We can look in here and see that there's actually, as we see, the application architecture is made up of those three systems. Those systems are then connect through to the technology architecture down here. So again, just think about, of course, what the way you might want to present information is. 3D is pretty useful for understanding complex structures. It's not necessarily the thing you'd present to management, but it tends to be used within the architecture office as a way of understanding things. And that, of course, gets us on to the very nature of who your stakeholders are and, of course, what information you want to present to them. So look here and start to think about that. And you remember in TOGAF there are a number of stakeholders defined. So why don't we look at those? And so in Abacus you have dashboards. Okay. So here you can define a dashboard. So they're the dashboards that are defined for TOGAF, for the sample, and all they are is basically a saved collection of views, be they charts, be they 2D, whatever. So you've got things like a PMO dashboard here, and a human resources dashboard, a IT operations dashboard. And in Abacus you can define roles, and then you can associate a role with a dashboard. So here the PMO role has been associated with the PMO dashboard, which means in that role, when someone logs on according to that role, they'll be presented that dashboard. And there's a permissions security model behind the scenes, so you can specify what elements of the repository you want that role to be able to see. So we do full create, read, update, delete. So you can start to segment and demarcate who's working on what and who can see what according to different dashboards. Let's have a look at a couple of those. So in here you can go, now this I'm a super user here, so I can sort of see all dashboards, but of course not all users could do that. So let's have a PMO dashboard. So what it will do, it will build up the collection of views according to that stakeholder. So first of all, it's closing down all the old ones. Now it's opening the ones that's relative to that person. So they're interested in seeing the value chain from phase A, business function, decomposition diagram, from phase B, that business footprint diagram we saw, and a landscape picture. So it is, again, just thinking about the views that they want to see. If we go here, let's have a look at another one, maybe, I don't know, the human resources. Let's look at what they see. So these people are not surprisingly interested in the org chart. They're interested in an application location, so who uses applications at certain locations, and some of those pie charts down here. And of course, you can have any number of dashboards, and the standard's pretty good at specifying what artifacts, so what views each of those stakeholders are interested in seeing. So this is an application, IT operations application person, so not surprisingly they're interested in the application landscape view, and they're interested in seeing the costs of their applications, the application roadmap. So that's the way that you start to present things which are of interest to someone. Those dashboards, you think of who your stakeholders are, you configure dashboards, and so of course the standard has already defined a lot of that. So here out of the box you can reuse all those things and start filling them in. But there's also the whole concept of deliverables that you want to produce, and I talked about the architecture definition document as a main one. So let's have a look at that. So of course you can start to
Simon here. Yep. Do you mind and keep a note on the refresh time on the screens, because these are quite complex screens. So
sure.
Just mind that it takes a little while for other people's screens to refresh.
No, I appreciate that. Look, it's actually going. I think we're down to the last screen now. Anyway, just about. So sorry if you missed some of those things. Obviously, we're out of time. I've probably been going through a bit too much. So hopefully you got the idea. There's pie charts. There's box and line diagrams. You configure all those things, and let's generate this. So I'll start generating the architecture definition deliverable. So this uses a report builder engine. It's Microsoft Report Builder, so you can configure your reports as you please. So you use this so this is the free version, Visual Web Developer, Visual Studio. So you just design your reports using whatever section you need in them. So there's a document control section and things like that. So I'm not too sure. Yeah, good point. So this may not be refreshing very quickly, but needless to say, you put all the diagrams in, you design your reports, and then Abacus will be able to generate them for you directly out of the tool set. So hopefully you see that and has whatever a title page and document control. And then start to get sections in here, for example, the objectives that you had, the measures, those stakeholders that you had. So this table's generated, and as you go through, you start to get lots of different here. This is your list of stakeholders still. You're now looking at the goal, objective, service diagram, so one of the viewpoints. We're into the principles, so the compliance section of the deliverable. So these things are all very well specified. There's templates for them that you can use. Needless to say, they include all the different diagrams and all the different charts and things like that that are a project. You can see here, obviously, how it's showing the org chart like this, and I guess at the end we'll have that new impact of change view. So somewhere down here, there it is. So the new impact of change view has been included. So the deliverables can be automatically generated as quick as you want, and then you save them out to Word and do whatever topping and tailing you may want to do and customization of them. So produce deliverables is certainly something straight out of your architecture repository if you want. They're all very well defined. I'm sort of acutely with time, so just a couple of minutes. Last thing I really wanted to talk about was that published model. So here's the published version. So this is something we can provide. So drop us an email at that togaf@evolution.au, and from this you can navigate exactly the way you sort of have been doing. So you can go into, say, the application communication diagram here. You see that the tree builds. If I click on the SCRM, it shows it in here, which then says what other views that element exists in. So maybe in the data dissemination view, and so you can just drill around and see all this kind of stuff, all different ways that the information may hang together into different viewpoints and things like that, including all of the catalogs and all of the matrices and stuff like that. So yeah, looks like kind of what I wanted to show. It was mostly a whirlwind. I'm sure, who knows, you maybe only saw half of that, but need to say the published model's there, and you can go through and browse it to your heart's content, and obviously grab a copy of Abacus and then start to browse the actual model itself. And I think that's my time's done. We've got 15 minutes maybe, so I'm happy to throw open open to questions for you and Gary and Simon to read out. But yeah, look, just to wrap up, we've obviously looked at the entities and the relationships. We've looked at the different views or artifacts you can produce, who stakeholders are, the dashboards that they may want to see, and the different analysis techniques that you may want to do. So I think it's a pretty good kind of overview of TOGAF 9 and how it certainly has some tool support now. All right, Simon and Gary, over to you guys. Hopefully there's some questions.
That's many thanks. Just to emphasise to everyone that a full recording of this event will be available tomorrow. You'll all receive an email that will have the link that can take you to that event. If you have any problems with the refresh, being out of sync with the audio, I apologise, but as I said, it is being fully recorded, so you can watch that again at a convenient moment for yourselves. Yes, we do have quite a few questions, so I'll just work through them one by one.
Sure.
I've got a question here from Peter Bryant, and he asks, in the core Metamodel, linkage between business architecture and application and technology architectures seems to be solely through business service entity. That seems to be limiting. Am I right in observing that Abacus examples use richer linkages?
So, all right, so Peter, yeah, look, I mean, obviously so let's go back to the Metamodel picture here, I guess, so we can see what we're talking about. I'll get these other views. Yeah, look, and you're right. So when you look at the Metamodel view in TOGAF 9, it is a bit of a filter that most things go through. There's a few relationships here, the ground, the outside direct. So see, processes can be directly connected to applications with an involved relationship, the ownership relationship. So there's a few that do go around that. And certainly from Abacus's point of view, we certainly see, we support over 100 different frameworks. So there's any weird and wonderful ways you may want to do that you can bypass effectively this service layer. So needless to say, that's a faithful sort of transcription of what TOGAF recommends. And if you remember the slide, I'm not sure how well this is refreshing for us, but the slide here, you do see that the business service layer is a real kind of intersect between most things, but there are a few relationships that go around. Okay, so hopefully I think that answers your question. Yeah.
Yeah, we have a number of people asking about the relationship between Abacus and Archimate. Perhaps you'd like to just explain that, Tim?
And Gary's certainly better qualified to answer, well, certainly about Archimate, because he's the chair of that committee. Look, so Abacus supports Archimate. It's one of the 100-plus frameworks we support. Archimate, of course, is a notation that is pretty rich, and it certainly is potential that within the repository itself here, and there's a few of the views, it certainly creeps into some of the view here, maybe, where is it, the for engineering diagram. So this is starting to use some Archimate-like notation here, so these are obviously components in the Archimate world. Look, so Archimate is certainly supported by Abacus, and as I said, when it comes to the notation you want to use in TOGAF 9, you can choose, so certainly the process layer, you might want to use BPMN. In the application layer, you might want to use UML. The infrastructure layer, you may want to use Archimate. It's all completely flexible in terms of what you want to do. Again, all you should be thinking about is who your stakeholders are, and indeed what the best way to present information to them is. If we believe that Archimate is a useful way of showing things, then certainly feel free to do that. The Archimate Metamodel, of course, is different to the TOGAF 9 Metamodel. So that needs to be resolved, and there's work, and Gary can say some more about that. There's certainly work afoot to sort of get the two to coalesce in some way, I think is probably the polite way of saying it. So is there anything you wanted to add there, Gary?
I think the word coalesce is very good. There are a number of issues surrounding that, but yes, that is currently being addressed.
Okay, great.
We have a number of people, Tim, asking about web enablement of Abacus, and is it possible to use Abacus through a web front end?
Yeah, so I had a quick look at the publish model here. So the publish model is read-only. There's the ability to provide feedback. So you have feedback buttons on all the diagrams, so the owners of the various artifacts can be given feedback. So it's an element of interactivity, but no, the published version is read-only. And there's a few restrictions to that. The controls that you have in Abacus are very rich. So being able to reorder things, for example, simply being able to, do this sort of stuff, to order things however you like, to be able to do things. We've looked around a lot to try and find controls that can support the richness, and there just isn't quite there yet. But we've got some investment. We're a Microsoft partner, so there's investments in Silverlight and some of the new technologies that are coming out through Microsoft Shop to do that. But certainly it is a client install. The reality is, even with the web installs, there's usually some sort of ActiveX control you have to install anyway. So the sort of zero client install is a bit of a myth these days anyway, really. So certainly the ones that we've seen things deployed is, even under a virtualization environment or something like that, you can certainly provide it that way if you need some sort of bigger scale out, I think. Okay.
A question here from Peter Bryant. He's asking, is it possible to create a dynamic link between architecture repository and the matrix views? How do you create a repeatable view that dynamically updates?
Yeah, sure. So I guess I showed how we were pushing out the content. There is a whole matrix functionality in here. So if we go into this and decide that we want to do, let's say, applications to, let's do physical components and the relationship type as host. So it's obviously a matrix view directly in Abacus, and it's dynamically linked to the data. So as we wanted to, you could be adding relationships here and removing relationships. So that's entirely designed as a feature. What you actually just saw there pop up was because I removed a link here, it's now saying in my Metamodel I now have an application. What is it, a server here that is not providing hosting of any applications. So there's a whole model checking that goes on behind the scenes and can tell you if you've done something that's non-compliant. Yeah, so these views, matrices are embedded in there if you want. Sort of just for time, I was trying to kind of limit what I showed, but yeah, needs to say all these things are embedded in there as well as smarter ways of editing data. There's a whole data editor, which basically can do form-based entry of data and all that sort of stuff. So that exists.
Good. We have a questioner on the chat facility from Peter Schaefer. He's asking kind of a practical implementation question. He's asking, for an organisation of 200 to 500 people in IT and 5,000 business people, what is the effort to get your quality level, completion level set up from scratch and ongoing overhead of that to keep it up to this level?
Look, a great question. Very, very, how long is a piece of string question, unfortunately. Look, so the first thing I'd say is when it comes to maturity, there is some work that we've been doing to try and define what things are appropriate depending on the maturity of an organisation. So the first thing I just quickly open here is this. There's a bit of what we've done here to try and define a 5-level maturity model, and then talk about the different viewpoints that exist and your stakeholders. So you can start to say, okay, if you're actually only at level 2, that holds down the catalogues you should do for the given stakeholders. So there's some work there already to think about what you want to produce for people depending on your maturity. Now, having said that, if you're starting off quite immature, where we come from is because Abacus is completely flexible and it allows you to have any objects you want, any attributes you want, things like that, we always recommend an incremental approach. We definitely don't recommend a big bang approach. So we recommend take the artifacts you already have, because you possibly already have an application register, an Excel spreadsheet with all your applications. You possibly already have a services catalog. So these things that exist, just import them very quickly, get yourself a repository which has some core content in it, start to produce some views, start to make some bubble charts, some pie charts, get it out onto the web and get people to give you feedback. So I'd never recommend, a 6-month, deep, dark dive into documenting everything. I'd always recommend an incremental one. So when you've got 200 to 500 people, there's certainly a deployment there where, we have certain clients with hundreds of users, but needless to say, there's a deployment where you'd start with a handful of people and you'd build out from that as you build in popularity of the function, you prove your value. There's a presentation I do about the proving the value of enterprise architecture, so I can provide that. Needless to say, it's be incremental. That's the big recommendation, and a lot of the other competition, certainly for us, talk about a big bang approach, and that's primarily because their meta model is very fixed, and so you need to think very carefully about putting content in because it's very hard to change. And because our model's flexible, just get something in there and get it out, get it published, build on it, be incremental. So I think this is the question, hopefully.
Okay, we've got here from John Polgreen. He's asking, does Abacus directly implement the TOGAF meta model, or does it emulate it? Yeah,
okay, interesting question. I think it directly does. I mean, there's been some, where are we? picture. There's definitely been some processes. So TOGAF 9 has been deployed. A number of organisations have now done it. We've obviously worked with the Open Group on the sample project to try and pull it together into a consistent or cohesive whole. So there's had to be some work that we've done there, and we're working with the Architecture Forum now to feed back that experience. So there's no doubt about it. There's a few terms here that may be a little bit different. Network component, for example, is not explicitly defined in the Metamodel. It talks about physical technology components. There's a little bit of variation here, so there's no doubt about it. We do have a faithful transcription exactly of the Metamodel as it is defined in TOGAF, with all of the entity types, like you've seen here with physical application component, logical application component. But we've just found through our experience of it being deployed now for the last sort of 6 to 9 months that there's some, as we say, experience we've got here which makes this more fit for purpose. And look, we'll to see as the certification scheme for TOGAF 9 is still ongoing, so we're waiting to see necessarily whether we're going to do an exact vanilla certification or not. So that's still up in the air a bit. But yeah, to say you can have the vanilla version if you want, but we certainly believe that with the 6 to 9 months worth of experience, this is a slightly better version. So we'll wait and see.
I think my question here for Gary. Gary, this is from Sad Al-Shahir. He's asking, how can we participate and join some of the groups like the Semantic Interoperability and SOA group?
Well, I would suggest that you email me first of all and tell me what it is that you're interested in becoming involved in, and then I will point you in the right direction.
Okay, Gary. Gary email address will be ghdoherty@opengroup.org, yes?
Yeah, you can get me at gary@opengroup.org. That's Gary with 2 R's.
Thank you. Well, what is it? We've got 3 more minutes. We've got still loads of questions, but I'm just going to go through them one by one. Tim, I've got a question here from Mushandi. How do you see How do you see this working when the multiple EA projects at strategic, segment, and capability levels each have their own deliverables, artifacts, etc.?
Yeah, good question. So we haven't got much time, but I'll just, the crash course in that is, in Abacus you can support multiple architectures. So this is obviously just a dive through on an as-is, but what you can do is an evolution. So this is now an evolution off that baseline, and what you would do in each of your project architectures, you'll now model this. So you may have many project architectures here. You may want to model this architecture into many iterations. So this particular architectural continuum. Okay, so I obviously skipped over that because I didn't think we had time, but needless to say, you've got your as-is and your interims and your target states. So however you want to model all of these different evolutions, as we call them, you then embody those into your deliverables. Of course, is saying this is your current state, this is where you've been 5 years, this is where you want to be in 10 years, as effectively a decision tree or some sort of forward-looking evolution, as we call them. So the ability to have multiple architectures is something pretty unique to us in that you can have all these different scenarios and model them and compare and contrast them for metrics and all that good stuff that you want to be doing in the gap analysis phases towards the end of the ADM. So that's a big whirlwind answer. And of course, if we don't have time for the questions, feel free to forward them all on to us, and we'll try our best to just answer them in text or something like that as well. So.
Absolutely. Well, we've got I think more minutes, so I'll just go through just a couple more questions, and then we'll call an end to the presentation. Quite a few asking about demo versions of Abacus. Tim, is there a demo version available?
Yep, there is. So I gave a URL, but the web page address is here. I'll just go. So it's evolution.eu there. So jump on the web page, click the download link, and request that. So we get free 30-day trials, and there is the TOGAF sample project. So obviously, if in your notes here, when you request the software, something you just say I'm going to be doing TOGAF or something like that, and our guys will know to send you the TOGAF sample project. So click on to evolution.eu, request trial, go for it. All are freely available, by the way, with Abacus. I mean, you obviously need to pay for Abacus itself, but needless to say, we don't charge anything for any of the different frameworks. They're all freely downloadable through the, most of them are deployed with the tool, but there's new ones made all the time, so you're freely available. So.
Well, I think we're now close to the full hour, so I think it's time that we wrap this event up today. I would like to encourage everyone to keep an eye on the future schedules of webinars coming from the Open Group. We will certainly continue this series of webinars about TOGAF. I'd like to thank Tim and Gary today for their presentations, and we will certainly be working through the questions that we haven't been able to answer today. So once again, thank you all for participating, and thank you, Gary, and thank you, Tim, for presenting very well. Many thanks, and I'll end the presentation there.
Thanks, everybody.